Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. We're going to study the arrest of Jesus this morning. Last week we ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. We were in Matthew 26, and we're still in Matthew 26. But the previous section ends. This is Jesus, and he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this section ends, and it makes a very quick segue into Jesus being arrested. And in verse 46 we read last week, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And if you actually go back to verse 45, he tells the disciples, "There sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." So what we see now is that hour is here. Jesus is going to be handed over. And just like Jesus prophesied earlier in this chapter, just as Zechariah prophesied, the shepherd will be struck, and the sheep are going to scatter. That's what we'll see at the end of this section. One of the main commentaries that I consult in studying Matthew is a large 3-volume commentary by these guys. Davies and Allison are their names. And they frame this particular story, and really the passion narrative of Jesus would fit this as well. But in particular, the arrest of Jesus, they say it conveys sorrow through irony. Irony is where something happens that you don't expect it to happen. You kind of would think the opposite would happen, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of that. Really, the gospel itself is ironic, because you have the perfect, sinless Lamb of God dying the death of a criminal. That in and of itself is very ironic. But this story is full of it, and we'll point some of that out as we go through it. For starters, just looking at it before we read it, Jesus, he's not betrayed by some stranger, but rather it's by one of his closest friends, by one of the 12, by Judas Iscariot. There's also the fact that this crowd comes. They're the ones who come, and they arrest him. They come with swords and clubs for a man who's not violent. He's never shown any tendency of violence, besides maybe overturning the tables in the temple. But besides that, I wouldn't say that's violent. And he's not going to resist them. Yet they come with swords and clubs. And Jesus will point out the irony of that as they're taking him away. The one who betrays Jesus, you'd think he would arrest him. You'd think they'd do something like put him in handcuffs or harm him in some way. But the betrayer kisses him and greets him. Judas Iscariot, of course. And we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. And then finally, Jesus' very own disciples. These are the people that are the closest to Jesus. They've had the most intimate look out of anybody at the things Jesus has done, the things Jesus has taught, what they've seen in Jesus, so on and so forth. And yet, instead of standing by him, they leave him and they flee, even despite what they've said earlier in the chapter. You may remember early on, Jesus foretells this, and he quotes the prophet Zechariah in saying that the shepherd will be struck and the sheep will scatter. And they go on in verse 35. Peter says, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. Well, they mean well, but what we're going to see is they're going to cower, and as Jesus is arrested, they're going to flee. So with that, let's get into the story of the arrest of Jesus. Starting in Matthew 26 and verse 47, it's on the screen. It says, "While he was still speaking," he, there is Jesus, "Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people." I said it a moment ago, and I'll say it again. The scene here shifts very quickly. This is a quick transition. Matthew points out here that this is while Jesus is saying these things that this stuff begins to happen. The hour that he's speaking of, it's not just at hand, it's here. It is in the present moment. It's unfolding now before their very eyes. And so as Jesus is saying these things about how the hour is at hand and his betrayer is at hand, all of a sudden, here everything comes. There's something grammatically that's interesting. I guess not grammatically, but it's in the original language, and a lot of the translations pick it up, but the ESV doesn't, so I want to point it out. We see here that Judas comes. there's a word that the ESV actually leaves out of their translation, and I assume it's because it seems redundant. But the word in the Greek, it's I do. It's translated usually behold or see or something along those lines. The ESV and others leave that out, I guess because it's redundant. But it kind of paints an interesting picture for us in terms of the shift that we're seeing here. Because what we've seen, Jesus, he's in the garden, he's praying, he's very sorrowful, even to the point of death. And he's rebuking the disciples for falling asleep and not keeping watch. And then, as he's speaking, behold Judas. That's how this text literally reads. This is a monumental shift that we see taking place right here. Behold Judas. I think if you have a New King James or a New American Standard, it uses the word behold, but some other ones don't include it. And I'm not totally sure why. I assume it's because it might be redundant, but I think you lose something if you leave that out. So Judas comes. Behold Judas. And he is, of course, one of the 12. We touched on this a little bit last week. CJ pointed out that in other gospel accounts it points out that as they go to the garden, Judas leaves and now he comes back. Well, Matthew doesn't point that out. And so to Matthew's readers, if they're not aware of what the other gospel accounts say, this is a bit of a surprise. Because we haven't learned that Judas wasn't with them. But now we see that Judas has come. And so evidently he left at some point, and now he returns. And as we've already pointed out, as has been pointed out repeatedly by Matthew, even as early as chapter 10, Matthew points out that Judas is the betrayer. And here he points out that he's one of the 12. This again is showing the irony of what is taking shape. It's not some stranger that's betraying Jesus. It's not one of his enemies even. It's one of his friends. It's one of the 12. And so Judas comes, and he's not alone. He has with him a great crowd. One of the things that's interesting, if you look at the beginning of this chapter, in verse 3, it says, the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the place of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So even as far back as the beginning of this very chapter in Matthew 26, we see that they are wanting to arrest Jesus by stealth. They don't want to get caught. They don't want other people to catch wind of it. Well, now we've seen a shift. And it's not necessarily known as to how or why this shift occurs, but they go from not wanting to do it in front of people to now they bring a great crowd to do it. Matthew emphasizes the size of this crowd. It's not just a crowd. You know, a crowd is a big enough group of people. But this is a great crowd. He has that modifier with it. This is a great crowd. And so they've went from being afraid of killing Jesus publicly and being afraid of doing it at the time of the feast to now it's during the feast, and there's a great crowd that comes. Reminds me of in Acts 26 and verse 26. This is not something that was done in a corner. This is something that everyone saw. You can't deny that it happened. This wasn't something done in secret. They did this, maybe not publicly per se, because they're still in a more secluded area in Gethsemane, but now there's a crowd there, and it's a great crowd. There's many witnesses to this. And of course, the disciples are among those witnesses that see all of this taking shape. So there's a great crowd that comes. This is not done in a corner. We see that they come with swords and clubs. The word that's translated as clubs, I think literally refers to like a wooden stick. Club, I think, is a good way to translate that. That kind of carries the idea. It's a weapon. They have swords and they have clubs. And the irony here, again, is quite obvious. They bring weapons, swords and clubs, things that are deadly, for someone who is not violent, who's not guilty of anything, and who isn't going to resist them. It's very unnecessary. The word, it's a word that I always find funny to use. The word that the commentators use is this is superfluous. It's not necessary. This is something that, again, is heightening the irony in this entire story. And it also adds to the drama of what's unfolding here. This is a very dramatic scene as it's unfolding here. There's betrayals, there's scattering of people, there's eventually going to be the violence that's done to Jesus, so on and so forth. And so this heightens the drama of the situation as well. And we see also where this crowd has come from. They come from the chief priests and the elders of the people. These are the ones who, as we just read earlier in verse 3 of this chapter at the beginning, they're the ones who are plotting to arrest Jesus. This, of course, recalls those verses. It's the chief priests and the elders. It also recalls some of the other predictions that Jesus has made of his suffering, such as, for example, I have verses 3 and 4 on the screen here. The chief priests and the elders of the people, they gathered at Caiaphas' house. They're plotting together how to arrest him and kill him. It also might make you recall something like Matthew 16, where Jesus begins to show what's going to happen to him. It says, from that time on, Jesus, this is Matthew 16 and verse 21, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Elders and chief priests are mentioned again here. It's interesting when you look at Matthew's gospel, and throughout most of the gospel, the antagonists are Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes. Yet when it actually comes to Jesus getting killed, we see the chief priests and the elders take a more prominent role in that. And what this shows us, if anything, is the Jewish leadership, which was so frequently divided against itself. You can see their division in, the council, the Sanhedrin. You can see it. Paul uses this to his advantage in the book of Acts when he pins them against each other, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, about the resurrection. He makes a quick exit there in that story in Acts. I liken it to Democrats and Republicans. They're usually at odds with each other, but they can agree on certain things. And here they agree, these Jewish leaders do, about killing Jesus. All of them have that in common. They want to see Jesus' demise. Verse 48 says, now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man, seize him. Notice, Matthew now refers to Judas as the betrayer. He doesn't use his name, but he calls him the betrayer. This is something that's interesting because the next and final time that Matthew will use Judas' name in this gospel account is in the next chapter when Judas hangs himself. Judas is not mentioned by name any longer. Instead, he's referred to as the betrayer here in this story. And so we see how Matthew is painting this picture. Judas, he's no longer one of the 12. He's now the betrayer. And the betrayal is now, of course, at hand. And he says he's going to give them a sign. It makes you wonder, why would they need a sign? You would think they would have known who Jesus was. Some explain this as saying, well, it's at night, it's dark, maybe they couldn't see. Well, Judas can see him. I don't see how the others couldn't see him as well. Maybe darkness does explain it. But it almost appears, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that this crowd, which, keep in mind, is sent from the chief priests it's sent by the chief priests and the scribes, they don't know who Jesus is. They're not sure who it is they're coming to arrest. He's arrested by people that he doesn't even know. I don't think it's too big of a stretch to say that. This is a professional mob that is hired to come. It seems, if you read between the lines there, they're hired to come to seize Jesus, to bring him back, and to have Jesus go through a mockery of a trial and eventually be delivered up to be crucified. Go ahead, Brad.
I'm sorry. Judas could have thought they were going to try to substitute somebody else.
And he is.
Maybe that. I'm sorry, I'm not saying it.
I get what you're saying. Maybe to avoid trickery
of
Jesus, maybe getting switched around or something. Maybe that's why he does the kiss. He gives the sign. Garfield, do you have something?
I was going to mention that he looked like all the other Jews. He wasn't blonde-headed, or those type of things. He had to be pointed out to them who he was.
Yeah.
He
Yeah. It's dark because it's night, presumably, and Jesus, his appearance, I mean, we don't really know much of his appearance, but we know that he was a Jewish man, and there's nothing that would indicate that he looked different. He's not blonde-haired and blue-eyed like what some people might imagine. Tom?
My thought is this, later on you're going to get to the servant of the high priest getting his ear struck off. It's unlikely that the servant has ever seen who Jesus was, because he was in the company of the high priest all this time. This is possible, too, that it's a crowd of people. Yeah, Jesus had thousands of people following him, and he preached to thousands of people at one time. But this could be, honestly, a group of people that have never seen him, but they know of him. They know what he's done. They know of the things that he said against the temple, and that just, outrageous. That's, kind of like today, people getting a half story of what's going on.
Yeah. And Tom points out that it's very likely that this crowd maybe had heard of Jesus, maybe had heard, some things about Jesus from other people, but probably hadn't seen him for themselves. And so that just shows us again that this is a crowd that doesn't know who Jesus is, and it adds to the irony of this. He's betrayed by a friend, and he's arrested by people who don't even know him, and they probably have heard charges of what he's done, like saying he's going to destroy the temple and so on and so forth, but they don't know for certain what he's done or anything of that nature. It just adds to the irony of this. And so the sign is this: the one I will kiss is the man. Here we have more irony. The fact that Judas, he says he's going to kiss the man. Yet he's not coming to bring affection. He's not coming to wish Jesus well. He's instead bringing what will lead to violence and murder, capital punishment for someone who's not guilty, an unjust killing. And this, of course, might remind us of Herod in the fact that he's cloaking his true intentions. He's come to hand Jesus over, and yet he does so with a kiss. This might remind us of in Matthew chapter 2, Herod eventually is going to go on a baby killing spree there in that part of the world because he's threatened by the newborn king of the Jews. How someone could be threatened by a baby, I'm not sure. He must have been fairly insecure in himself. But we read here, Herod summoned the wise men. You may recall from that story, the wise men come from the east and they say, "Where is he who's born King of the Jews? We saw his star." And so they know that the newborn King of the Jews is coming. They're aware of the prophecy. It seems more so than even the Jews were at that time. But we read, Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." Herod tells them, "I want to know where the newborn king is so that I can go and worship him." But of course we know that's not what he is actually going to do. He wants to go and he wants to kill him. And that's why when eventually they don't bring word to Herod of where he is, he goes on the killing spree. He wants to make sure that this newborn king is dead so that there's no threat to his throne. And so we see again masked intentions. He says he wants to go worship him. Herod does. Really, he's going to kill him. Same thing here with Judas. He's going to kiss Jesus, but really what he's going to be complicit in is Jesus being delivered up to be crucified. So he says, "The one I will kiss is the man sees him." The word in the original language here, when it's used of people against people, because sometimes it might be used to grab hold of something like an object, but when it's used in reference to people against other people, you can see the undertone that has. It has a hostile undertone, similar to laying hands on someone. And the word for that is going to be used later on when they do eventually arrest Jesus. But you can kind of see the undertone of this. There's hostility here. And it just adds again to the irony and to the drama. They have to seize one who is not guilty of any crime, who is not going to resist, and yet he says to seize him. And now we see the betrayal take place. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. Notice that Judas does not waste any time. As we're reading this in Matthew's gospel account, this is we're taking our time going through it, but this is actually unfolding pretty quickly for Matthew's readers. There's no time in between. It's just one thing after another, and that intensifies what is going on here. Because so much of what we've been looking at is so slow and drawn out. And yet here, this story, it happens rather quickly. He came up to Jesus at once. He doesn't waste any time in betraying Jesus. It's almost as if he's giddy to betray Jesus. And then we see this greeting. He says, "Greetings, Rabbi." Just as with the kiss that's coming, Judas's greeting here is phony and it's insincere. And I say that because the word that is translated as greetings is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word shalom. That word means peace, but when it's used in a greeting, it usually means peace to you or goodwill to you, so on and so forth. It's an expression of well wishes and goodwill. Similar to what we might say when we say, "Have a good day," or something along those lines. This is the Greek equivalent of that. The word in the Greek, I believe, is kaireo, or something along those lines. And this is, again, ironic because the betrayer, of course, does not wish Jesus well. If he wished him well, he wouldn't be betraying him. And yet here we see him use this greeting. And it is phony. It's not sincere. He doesn't mean it. This just adds to the drama. It adds to the hurt of the betrayal, the lip service that, of course, is accompanied with a hardened heart. So he says, "Greetings, Rabbi." Rabbi is reminiscent of a story we looked at previously in this chapter when Jesus has foretold that one of them is going to betray him. You may recall that story where they're gathered together to partake in the Passover meal. And Jesus says in verse 21, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." Remember that's a dramatic thing that Jesus has said. This is news to them, that one of them is going to betray him. And in verse 22 it says, "They were very sorrowful, and they began to say to him one after another, 'Is it I, Lord?'" So here in verse 22, the disciples refer to Jesus as Lord. Yet later in verse 25, when Judas speaks, he says, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Big contrast. The other disciples refer to Jesus as Lord. Judas simply refers to him as Rabbi. That is an indication of what has already happened in Judas's heart, that Jesus is no longer his Lord. Now he's just a rabbi, the one who's going to end up being betrayed. What we see here is Judas's insincere greeting. It puts him in the same camp as those who are going to eventually mock Jesus at the cross. They hail him as King of the Jews. They give him the lip service, which ironically is the correct things to say. Jesus is not just the King of the Jews, but the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And yet you see the lip service with, of course, very bad intentions. They do so in a mocking sense. And Judas is almost at that point here. He's doing it as a sign, not necessarily in a mocking way, but the undertone is very similar. He's doing something that on the surface looks really nice, but of course his intentions is for Jesus to be handed over and to be betrayed and to be killed. And so this puts him in the same company as those who will mock Jesus at the cross. And we'll look at that when we get to that point. We see that Judas kisses him. To Matthew's Jewish readers, perhaps Proverbs 27 and verse 6 would ring in their ears. This proverb, I actually have a quotation here from the New American Standard because I didn't like how the ESV put it. The word here could be translated a few different ways, and this seems like a better translation. But Proverbs 27 and verse 6, as the New American Standard reads it, it says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy." We see here Judas, he's now went from a friend of Jesus to his enemy, to the betrayer, as Matthew just called him in the previous verse. We see that this kiss is from an enemy, and it is, of course, very deceitful. And yet, look at Jesus' response in verse 50. This is just unbelievable. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. Notice, firstly, Jesus said. Said is the only verb that is used of Jesus in this story. Other than that, Jesus does nothing. All he does is speak. This is, of course, looking at the fact that he is going away. He's not resisting. He's not doing anything. All he does is speak. He does this also in verse 52 and verse 55. He speaks, otherwise he does nothing. There's no other verb that's used of Jesus here in this story. Notice that Jesus calls him friend. The one who's betrayed you, would you call him friend? The one who has done just an absolutely horrific harm to you, would you still call him friend? Well, Jesus does here. And it's interesting, Matthew calls him the betrayer. That's what he said earlier in verse 48 or 49. In verse 48, the betrayer had given them a sign. So Matthew calls him the betrayer. Jesus calls him friend. And that, of course, makes us think of Jesus' very teachings in the Sermon on the Mount when he speaks of, for one, turning the other cheek. When someone strikes you, turn the other cheek also. This is, I think, an indication of being struck on the cheek. And what does Jesus do? He turns the other cheek. And then the very next teaching is about loving your enemies. Judas has now become an enemy of Jesus. And yet Jesus still loves him, and he still refers to him with the term of endearment as his friend. Jesus, of course, is living up to his teachings. And he says, "Friend, do what you came to do." This is a difficult phrase to translate. It's kind of ambiguous in the Greek. Greek is like that sometimes because there's no commas or periods or question marks or exclamation points. So sometimes you're kind of left guessing, and the context usually will determine how you might translate something. But this is rather ambiguous. And if you compare this, if you have a New King James or if you have a Christian Standard, they phrase this as a question and not as a statement where Jesus says, "Friend, do what you came to do." So here is an example of that. Here's the English Standard, what I'm reading from. "Friend, do what you came to do." The New King James reads, "Friend, why have you come?" And in the Christian Standard, it's the same thing except there's a clause in the middle. "Friend, why have you come?" Most modern English translations will translate it either as one or the other, either as a statement, "Do what you've come to do," or as a question, "Friend, why have you come?" But there's a few other ways that this could also be translated. Davies and Allison point some of these out, such as, "Is that why you're here?" And that could refer either to the kiss or perhaps more appropriately to the betrayal. Is that why you're here? That's another way that this could be translated. Or perhaps something along the lines of, "I know for what you are here." Regardless of how you might translate this, we see that Jesus, he's fully aware of the situation, he's fully in control, and that point will be made clear after one of those with Jesus, who John refers to as Peter, cuts the servant's ear off, and Jesus, of course, will say, "I could call 12 legions of angels." And we'll get to that in a moment, if I can get through my material. So he says, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up, and they laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. that word laid hands is kind of violent. It's implicitly violent. The word, I remember this from Greek class, of all things. I don't remember very many Greek words from when we did vocabulary all those years ago, but one of the words I remember is the word ballo. It means to throw, and that's easy to remember because you throw a ball, right? That's how I remember it. Well, this word is the word for throw with a prefix in front of it, and what this is implying is they don't just lay hands on him, but they throw their hands upon Jesus. This is not just violent, but it's actually somewhat emphatic in nature. They throw their hands on Jesus and they seize him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. One of those who were with Jesus. One thing that's interesting, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all four Gospels record this story. You could say it's important when Jesus is betrayed and arrested. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not specify which of those, who it is that does this, but John specifies that it is Peter in John 18 and verse 10. So that's just a tidbit that you can take away. And we see that he stretches out his hand and he draws his sword. This makes you wonder, what in the world is one of Jesus' disciples doing with a sword? It's interesting when you read, I think it's in Luke's account, and I'm not going to talk about this much because Jim's probably going to go into detail about it because there's not an overlap in Matthew. But in Luke's account, it mentions that they had two swords there with them. Why would they have a sword? It almost makes you wonder if they still really get what Jesus is about. The fact that he's going to be betrayed and handed over, and he's going to go peacefully. He's not going to resist. Maybe they don't realize that yet. But as we're reading here in Matthew, this is both unexpected and also unexplained. And so because Matthew doesn't explain it, I won't spend a lot of time on it. Do you have something on that, Tom?
I was just going to say in Luke also, I forget where it's at. It's during this time. Jesus tells them, if you don't have a sword, to go get one, go buy one. If you have to sell your cloak to get a sword, you can.
Yeah.
So.
We'll let Jim get to that in his sermon class.
In verse 38 of Luke 22, he says, and they said, Lord, behold, there are two swords. And he said unto them, it is enough. So I just had the other sword. My thought was, and I'll tell you the reason I think it was Thomas, because Thomas made the statement, let us go up and die with him.
Maybe.
When he was going up there. I mean, I just don't know for sure, but my guess he's one of the other two.
Luke tells us that they have two swords. John evidently tells us that Peter had one of them. We're not sure who had the other one, but in Matthew this is unexpected and also unexplained, and so we'll move on. But this is how the story unfolds. He takes his hand, draws his sword, he strikes the servant, and he cuts off his ear. John also names the servant of the high priest. This is a man by the name of Malchus. And he is perhaps the leader of this mob. Because remember, the chief priests and the scribes have sent this crowd. You know, Caiaphas is the high priest, and so this is a servant of the high priest who would be in close cahoots with the chief priests. And so maybe he's the leader of this mob. That's what most commentators believe, but the text doesn't say that, so we can't know that for certain. But this is a high-ranking person, regardless. This is someone who would be a prominent person. And here, one of Jesus' people cuts his ear off. Again, we see irony here. And this again heightens the shortcomings of the disciples. This is something in the Passion narrative that is brought up again and again and again, and we'll see it again at the end of this story when they scatter. But it stands in big contrast with Jesus. Here you have one of the 12, Peter, as John tells us, drawing the sword, striking the servant, cutting his ear off. And yet what is Jesus doing? He's not resisting. He's going away peacefully. He doesn't want any violence. And we see that in Jesus' response as he rebukes this disciple. Then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Notice that nothing happens to Peter in this story besides this rebuke from Jesus. You'd think striking a high official that they'd arrest him too. Well, evidently they don't. And what we see here is, again, this story, this particular story, although the passion narrative in and of itself is going slowly, this story just quickly moves from one thing to the next to the next. We move on now to Jesus rebuking this disciple. And so the story just moves on. Matthew doesn't dwell on what may or may not have happened to Peter. And what this shows us is the crowd, they really couldn't care less. What they're there for, the person they're after, it's not Peter. It's not any of the other disciples. They are there for one person and one person only, and that person is Jesus. Judas showed them who it was. He kissed him. That's the person they have in their custody now. So all they care about is taking Jesus and killing him. Brad, go ahead.
One of the things that is remarkable is Jesus frees himself from he's not subdued by their binding him, and he frees himself and touches this man's ear and heals him.
Yeah.
Right there in the midst of this chaos, he frees himself, touches this man, heals his ear. It's a remarkable thing. And one of the reasons that it's, it says that Marcus is Marcus is a right word, we suspect that this is a disciple later on. But he heals this man right before their eyes.
Yeah. I was bummed that Matthew doesn't record that. That's in one of the other accounts where Jesus reaches and touches the man and heals him. And Brad points out that despite being, arrested and in custody, Jesus is still able to reach out and touch this man and heal his ear. Kind of an interesting story there in and of itself, the healing of this man. And you can't help but wonder, what would have happened to that servant after the fact? Would he have come to faith after seeing that? We don't know, unfortunately.
The whole mood of this violent swing of the sword, and then Jesus, what could have turned out to be a battle in a sense, could have quickly been healed when Jesus healed his ear. You can imagine how taken back everyone is when they see this miracle. You've never seen anything like this before. It can change the whole mood of that situation.
It makes you wonder, for a crowd that probably didn't know Jesus, hadn't seen anything he'd done, they see him heal this servant. Makes you wonder what they were thinking as they're carrying him away.
Some sort of respect for Jesus to begin with. I think if you read John, I believe, they all took a step back and bowed down to the ground, and none of the other three mentioned it.
Yeah. All right, so
Jesus is keeping peaceful, but if he wasn't peaceful about all of this, then what does that do to the prophecy in Isaiah 53?
oh yeah, totally negate that.
What does it say? I couldn't hear.
I said, what does that do to the prophecy in Isaiah 53 if Jesus becomes violent along,
Amos points out that for Jesus to not resist, he's fulfilling the prophecy of the suffering servant, the one who is laying down his life. It's not taken from him, he lays it down. Yeah. So Jesus goes on to say, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. This response, it shows us two things when you think about it. On the one hand, it shows that violence, if you're a follower of Jesus, is not an option for response. Despite them somewhat violently taking Jesus, they lay hands on him. It's implicit language there. Despite that, Jesus says you don't respond with violence because it will be given back to you. And then also this shows us that those who are using violence against Jesus, not just those who are taking him and seizing him, but the ones who are going to beat him and scourge him and spit on him, those who will nail him to the cross, it will be returned to them as well. And in verse 53, Jesus says, do you not think or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? Do you not think, or do you think I cannot appeal to my Father? It's interesting, Peter, what he does, he draws a sword, he strikes the servant. Well, Jesus seems to be rebuking not just Peter's violent act, but really what is the underlying thing behind that, why it is that Peter would do that. It's because of a lack of faith. Jesus, don't you think I could appeal to my Father and this could end this second? What this shows us is, again, Jesus is willingly going. If he wanted out, he could get out. But we see him living up to what he said in his prayer in the garden earlier when he said, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Your will be done." Jesus is submitting to the will of the Father. He could appeal to the Father, and he could have more than 12 legions of angels come to him. There's a lot of debate as to what the specific number of a legion is. The frequent number I read is 6,000 would be a legion. And I don't know that it's necessarily important, the exact number of angels that Jesus could call. Garfield points this out frequently, that one angel, you read what an angel does in the Old Testament and some of the stories in there. One angel would be enough to do the job, yet alone 12 legions of them. This emphasizes the power that Jesus has at his disposal, that he could call, yet alone the power that he has in and of himself, and yet he chooses to not use it. This is showing the meekness of Jesus, the power that he has, that he keeps under control. This is showing his meekness. This is a great example of that in this very moment. And one parallel here, and then I'll probably, I don't have time to go through the rest. I'll stop here in verse 53. But he mentions the 12 legions of angels. One thing is interesting. We don't know exactly how much a legion is. We know it's a big number. In fact, there's the demon who goes by the name Legion, for we are many. So really, if you want a literal definition, it's many. But perhaps there's a bigger number implied in that. But we do know a thing or two about the number 12. This is something interesting here. Jesus has just refused the help of one of the 12, of Peter. Peter strikes the servant, he cuts his ear off. Jesus refuses the help, and in fact, as we read in one of the other accounts, he ends up negating what he's done by healing that servant. And now he's rejecting not just help from the 12, but help from 12 legions of angels. Perhaps there's something to that. Any other comments or questions, Garfield?
In the 28th chapter of Matthew, after Christ went to the cross and he died and he rose, and when he was in the process of giving the Great Commission before he went back to heaven, in the 28th chapter of Matthew, he says, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given unto me." That's how much power Jesus had.
Garfield, if you didn't hear him, points out in the Great Commission, he begins that by saying, all authority has been given to me. And that's a lot of power. In fact, it's not just a lot of power, it's all power. You think of powerful people in our society, people that are pulling the strings and so on. Well, Jesus has all power after he's raised from the dead. Tom?
Just real quick, I think what we start to see here is Leviticus 19:15, which talks about an injustice court. That is starting to take place. And the importance of Leviticus is how you treat your neighbor, how you treat your brothers. And then also in Leviticus 17, you have exactly, with that betrayal of that kiss, you have, I think what one of the things Judas might be trying to avoid is that in Leviticus 17 it says, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart." And I think otherwise you incur sin. And I think that my thought is maybe that's what he's trying to avoid, is this incurring of sin by betrayal. And also that verse I was talking about was Luke 22, 36 and 37.
Yeah.
Where Jesus tells him to buy a sword.
Tom points out some of the underlying things in Leviticus. In particular, there's some things there about unjust courts and so on and so forth, and we certainly see a lack of justice here. an unguilty person is getting carried away with a crowd with swords and clubs, and he'll eventually get sentenced to capital punishment on a cross. And that will just become more and more evident when you go through the trial and the crucifixion itself and so on and so forth. And then he pointed out some things too in Leviticus about not hating your brother, maybe Judas trying to avoid some of that by, at the very least, maybe showing an outward sign, a kiss and a greeting. But it's not on the outside that matters, it's what's on the inside.
The fact that God saves all the apostles, including Judas. You know, they're not killed in this. It's just amazing to me that they're not taken, they're not killed, they're not nothing.
Yeah, Brad points out that none of the other disciples are arrested. Maybe that's because they scatter. But I think what it is more so even than that is they're after one man. They're after Jesus. They are zeroed in on their mission. Now is the time. They have the opportunity, and they're not going to waste it. So, all right, thank you.